It didn't occur to the researchers that actually autistic and women might be like a thing that you might want to put together and investigate. And so that's another community that's really being late diagnosed.
Dr. Zara Bain is a writer, researcher, and social justice advocate with a PhD in philosophy of social justice from the University of Bristol. She is the founder and director of Academic Audio Transcription, a disabled-led, disabled majority social enterprise providing accessible transcription and captioning for researchers, writers, and creators worldwide. Through this work, she not only champions digital accessibility, but also creates meaningful employment for the disabled, chronically ill, and neurodivergent professionals. Her expertise spans accessibility, neurodiversity, disability justice, anti-racism, and the impact of AI. She has published widely on injustice, microaggressions, and social inequality, and co-authored one of the world's first truly inclusive introductions to philosophy. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much, though. I'm so excited to be here. I really appreciate you inviting me on your show.
Of course. So, Zara, as a neurodivergent woman and expert for disabled people, can you please explain what neurodivergence is and what are some of the signs and symptoms of neurodivergence for our listeners?
Neurodivergence refers to the kind of collection of conditions in which people aren't what we call neurotypical, right? So, and the term originated specifically from generally autistic and ADHD communities. But actually, there are people who use it more broadly to cover things like dyslexia, dyspraxia, dyscalculia, and also depression, anxiety, and kind of what other people might call mental health problems, mental illness, or psychiatric disability, right? So it's quite a broad term. And while we're here as well, you see people saying that, I'm neurodiverse. We say neurodivergent because a population is diverse, but an individual is a divergent member of a population. I am neurodivergent and I'm a member of, everyone's a member of a neurodiverse population. In fact, I have a history of chronic illness, which I came to realize was disabling chronic illness. So I identify as disabled in a kind of political sense and legal sense. But I have a lifelong history of ME, or chronic fatigue syndrome, as it's sometimes called. And then in my mid-30s, I went through a re-diagnostic process and learned that actually all along, it was a genetic disease.
When we talk about neurodivergence, because it's become quite like the buzzword, on social media, can you talk about the ways that neurodivergent people learn or work that are different to somebody else? And if someone doesn't know if they are neurodivergent, what would a couple of very clear symptoms be that they could say, maybe I should do a test?
Because it includes such an umbrella, so somebody who's dyslexic is going to have really different needs potentially from somebody who's autistic, but really great with words, what we would call hyperlexic, right? So, and similarly, somebody who is autistic and who, for example, really thrives on routine and thrives on kind of structure, doesn't like transitions, doesn't like change, and someone who has ADHD who is going to perhaps, be dealing with a certain kind of inattentiveness, impulsivity, poor impulse control potentially, they're going to present differently. And then it gets even more complicated when you add them together, right? Because there's this mixing pot effect. So you have, there is another category of ADHD. These are people who are both autistic and have ADHD. And there's a narrative that says that, it's like the two sides of me are fighting. And then some people are like, oh no, actually it's just this new thing. But there can be a way in which they're interacting in complicated ways. I saw a social media influencer that I follow. She's a kind of she's a scientist mummy vlogger, right? And she is someone who for a while, her name's Kristen Summers. She's been talking a lot about being autistic, and she very recently was diagnosed with ADHD and started medication, because that's one key difference. You can't be medicated if you're autistic, you can't be medicated if you're dyslexic or if you're dyspraxic, but you can if you've got ADHD. She had a reel where she said it's like her ADHD suddenly goes quiet, but that makes her autism get louder. And so the way in which her brain has kind of navigated these two kind of like, it's not like a diametric opposition, they're not pulling directly against each other. It's like they're pulling, instead of it being two people on the ends of a rope, it's like a bunch of people pulling on different corners of a sheet.
My husband was diagnosed with ADHD as an adult. And I actually was recently diagnosed with ADHD, and I thought that I was the opposite, that I was like, I don't know what I thought, but it was actually Mel Robbins who was talking about women's symptoms of ADHD
Right.
versus men. And because I always thought, well, I'm not impulsive, I'm not like, I don't forget things. It's like that typical, stereotypical kind of like judgy vibe of ADHD. And then as she was talking about how women are mostly diagnosed incorrectly for ADHD because they're able to hide their symptoms, like masking, and also so they're, like you mentioned, inattentiveness. That is a symptom for women with ADHD, and for anyone listening that doesn't understand that, essentially struggling to focus on a task or like start a task.
My kind of diagnostic story is kind of interesting. So for years, a lot of my friends, and I had a lot of my friendships like one-to-one strong relationships rather than being like a squad of us or a crew. Everyone started getting diagnosed as being autistic, right? Or like or ADHD around the crew. And then and none of them, different contexts, different friendships. And there is a thought that I encountered some years ago that like you tend to gravitate towards each other. You tend to kind of find each other. Neurodivergent people find each other and kind of like build friendships. But anyway, so like I'd always had the suspicion that I'm autistic. I don't have a formal diagnosis for autism at all. And it was this thing where I think I was invited to Cambridge University to do a talk about something to do with disability and postgraduate stuff. And the person who invited me, a friend of mine, Dr. Jenny Harrico, she and I were chatting one day, and basically they all turned around and they were just like, well, they just talked to me and assumed that I had ADHD. And I was like, well, no, I mean, like, I don't have ADHD. And then it happened like 3 more times. And then I tweeted back when Twitter was still a thing, right? And about 5 people replied and were like, wait, you didn't know that you had ADHD? All of us ADHDers just assumed you were one of us.
So my mom has undiagnosed ADHD, and my husband had undiagnosed ADHD. And I would like think that I could like diagnose people. Like I was like anyone that had those classic symptoms of not being able to pay attention, like I was like, I think you might have ADHD, like, and I was like telling people, and some people get really offended, like they're like,
it's really complicated.
They're like, no, like, and I'm like, yes, like, but then I don't do that anymore because I've been diagnosed. So I was like, would I like someone saying that to me? And also, like you said, like everyone's symptoms are so different, especially like women to men or any sort of people. Like women hide ADHD symptoms because we learn at a young age how to cope with them. So masking is essentially like coming up with coping mechanisms. Like, for instance, writing a to-do list.
Yes, 100%.
Like, for everything. So that's what I do to mask my ADHD.
Having 2 different calendars, right? Having like a very kind of detailed and sort of system, that's completely true. And it's and masking's got a really complicated politics too, right? Because there's this idea that, so first of all, there's a story with a bunch of things in medicine too, which I know a bit from my research. So my PhD is specifically actually on the way that knowledge and actually in particular ignorance is used to kind of produce and reproduce social injustice. And one of the stories that sticks in my head is the way that, like, for a lot of conditions, more often than not, for a long time, we were only medicine only studies it in men and in male body people and male presenting people, right? It doesn't study it like in general. So they didn't start studying heart medicine, heart problems in women, sorry, until 1995.
And I know where you're going with this, but I'm just going to be quiet and let you say why.
Up until 1995, they just adjusted for height and weight and assumed that that would be sufficient for how you could work out, well, how is this going to present a population? So they just studied men and male body people, and they just said, okay, you know, like we're gonna just adjust down for height and weight, make them a little bit, and that'll be fun. That'll tell us everything we should know. We don't need to account for like the fact that there are different hormonal structures, the fact that there are different, you know, all these kinds of different things that are different in bodies. Anyway, so this happens again with autism, right? And it happens again with ADHD. And with ADHD, like the stereotype is like a hyperactive like boy, basically, right? And then the same is true for autism. And so there are people like, you know, Simon Baron-Cohen did all this research out of Cambridge University, I think, in the 2000s, 90s, 2000s, where the thought with autism was literally that it was having a male pattern brain, right? That you had an acutely male brain, like your brain was just so male that that's what made you autistic, and it had this kind of consequence that it didn't occur to the researchers that actually autistic and women might be like a thing that you might want to put together and investigate. And so that's another community that's really being late diagnosed too. It's literally like missing women. It's this missing population.
Yeah, it's this whole missing generation of women undiagnosed with ADHD.
Or multiple generations too, right? Like you said, your mom. I think my mom had undiagnosed ADHD. I think my dad is probably undiagnosed autistic. I think that it runs all the way through my family. And funny, I was talking to one of my cousins about this. He's just got an ADHD diagnosis as well. So like neurodivergence seems to have this kind of hereditary feature, even though it sounds like they're not quite clear on, you know, what the exact mechanisms are and all the rest of it. You know, what's your second question about how could you tell? Again, I'm not a clinical doctor, but for me, like a sense of unbelonging, a sense of not quite fitting, feeling a little bit like a square peg in a round hole. There's a business coach called Kip Rain, who's an ADHD for women in business expert, because we've got a niche on niches and it's great. But she's got a book called Square Pegs and Round Holes, because that's what like ADHD women seem to feel like very often, you know. For the ADHD part and maybe the autistic part, for me, I know that it's a sense of like, and this is so gendered, but the feeling like you're too much and you're not enough, right? Maybe like a personality or a communication style that just like, you know, barrels people over.
Right.
And they're a bit, oh, this is a bit much for me. Or the, you know, I can relate to you and the organizational strategy having to be really like on it. And this is the problem with the fact that, you know, that neurodivergence tends to run in families and that we tend to flock together. What you think of as normal maybe actually is not normal. Maybe it's actually that you are in a community that doesn't realize it's a community yet.
I really appreciate that, because there is a lot of shame like with autism and ADHD. I do want to switch gears a little bit. What drew you into the world of philosophy, social justice, and accessibility? And what keeps you inspired to keep going?
I mean, this is the answer that I had for a while. Like, I got sick at 14. I was basically bedbound for a while from the age of 14 onwards. And compared to just about everything else, philosophy was one of the things I could access, funnily enough, right? So philosophy, because I could think my way through things, because it's about reasoning about these really big questions, like, you know, the nature of existence, or the nature of goodness, or what's right, or the nature of justice and democracy. If you're a bright kid who's stuck in bed and you can't go to school a normal way, and you're also neurodivergent and you don't know it yet, that is like, I think, a really kind of accessible thing. No one in my family went to university except for like my distant cousins and stuff. And philosophy carried a kind of prestige and a kind of like sense of being able to participate in these sorts of quite serious subjects that, you know, maybe English literature doesn't. No offense to all the English lit folks. Like I value English literature. I think it's really important. But I think that when you're like 14, 15, and in a way, literally you're kind of, the rug's been swept out from under you and you're being you're in this period where everyone's talking about what are you going to do? What are you going to become? And you can't get out of bed, right? Having access to philosophy, which was really unusual. It's really unusual in the UK. It's not a mainstream subject as a, taught in and of itself. Very often it's taught as a upper secondary subject in relation to philosophy of religion. And I didn't go that route.
It sounds like it got you quicker, like, to your path to figure out like what your purpose is as well.
I think that's true. And I think I'm still kind of figuring out my purpose, but at the same time, I can't conceive of myself as not having done that thing, and I only just finished my PhD last year. It took me 10 years. Oh my God, I've had like 6 supervisors. I've had probably like 4 or 5 different PhD institutions. Like, it's not a standard route, but for some reason, there was just always this commitment that I could not do it. And the irony is, philosophy as a professional field, like, as it's practiced at universities, is one of the least accessible spaces, despite what I'm saying about the accessibility of actually how you can learn it. It's really pale male stale. It's just like mostly, I mean, it's doing work in some quarters, but like it's really quite hostile sometimes to doing work on disability, to being disabled. If you take all of the academic subjects and you plot the kind of the more diverse to less diverse ones on a line, philosophy is one of the least diverse.
Interesting. I didn't know that. But it doesn't surprise me.
Yeah, more like up there with like mathematics and physics, right? Like, they're doing better than philosophy is in diversifying their demographics, just for context.
We've talked very broadly about being inclusive. Let's talk about businesses in 2025. So what are some of the common mistakes that you think that they make? And what do you think would be some of like the real steps towards change?
I don't want to be critical, because I think it's really good that people have an intention and they have this kind of strong commitment. And I think that they have to understand that that commitment has to always come with like a willingness to be on a journey, right? You're going to be on a journey. You're going to go from where you are to somewhere better. And that's going to keep on being true, right? You'll never reach some final destination where you're going to have like achieved peak 100% inclusion. Doesn't really exist. You're going to get it wrong, right? You're going to make mistakes. And the question is going to be, what do you do when you make a mistake? Do you own it and apologize and commit to do better? Do you know how to apologize too, right? Which is one of those other things. Or are you going to be defensive and self-protective? And, how is that going to align with your commitment to wanting to be inclusive? Because if you're going to get into defensive mode, if somebody says actually missing, it's very hard to then learn the places where you can do better, right? So those would be my starting points. I mean, like, really bluntly, most companies, most institutions, organizations are terrible about disability, right? They just don't think about disability amongst the triumvirate of inclusion. Generally, it's like the big 3, right? It's like race, gender, class, And that's not to say that they get race, gender, class right, or they get it even close to being good. But those will be the things on their radar that they'll be like, oh, can't say that, can't do this, we should think about this. And disability will be like somewhere further down. The other ones that might be, differentially on the horizon will be like LGBTQIA plus rights, being trans inclusionary, being language inclusionary. There's a lot of work involved, and that's partly because of these structures and systems we've been talking about. We're not starting from a point where like we've already achieved gender parity of kind of like wages, and we've already achieved a situation where Black women can join the royal family and everyone goes, great, and says nothing, right? Like, we're living in this world that's got all of these kinds of toxic structures and toxic interactions. And so like it's kind of quite a big hill to climb, if we're going to commit to it personally. So I think those would be the first 3 things. And then like really practically, it's like audit where you're at. Be honest with where you're at with this stuff. Like, have a look at the composition of your teams. To what extent is your team majority white, majority, non-disabled, majority cis, het, straight? To what extent are the people within the communities that you build and the spaces that you create actually people who are unlike you, like people, because we're the
norm.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Right.
Which I hate to even say that, but it's like that is the best way to describe it.
Yeah.
what society views as the norm.
Exactly.
And I wonder, Zara, if you could give our audience some examples of injustice and microaggressions, because I've seen a lot of discourse online, like if someone asks for an accommodation and then all of a sudden they're fired.
One of the features of microaggressions, right, is it's like, who can tell that some kind of transgression has occurred, right? And in a lot of the microaggressions literature, the idea is that it's ambiguous to anybody, and that's sort of true, but it's also kind of true that it's not ambiguous to some people. Like, some people will be like, that was a microaggression, and the question is whether they can get other people around them from a different kind of identity set to pick up what they're saying. So, I've shown up in a mobility scooter, and someone who's given like a beautiful presentation on the role of like internationalist organizing on the part of like Frederick Douglass and W.E.B. Du Bois has then turned around and pointed at my scooter and gone, what put you in that thing? You're in a moment where like you're just minding your business and someone says something and it kind of catches you. You have to take a minute to go, oh, why was that a hit? Why did that feel like a hit, even though maybe it wasn't obviously a hit? The other ones that you'll get, this comes up all the time with the team that I work with in the context of my social enterprise. I tell people that if for any reason you can't complete a piece of work, don't tell us why. Just tell me that you can't do it as soon as possible. Because generally the norm is that if you're off sick, you have to try not to be sick, right? You have to drag yourself in with it anyway. And then you have to like kind of grovel and be like, please, sir, can you believe me? I've got this, that, and the other. It forces disclosure. If you have a wonky kind of body like me, like I can be having a flare up for reasons A, I don't know, and B, like it might not sound like a flare up to somebody who's not familiar with my body. I have been in the situation where I've had to kind of do the like, oh, I'm really sorry, I'm going to have to cancel, I'm ill because I have a really bad period. That's not a conversation I want to have with my male line manager necessarily. And it's also not a conversation he necessarily wants to have with me, right? And it's connected to my kind of multiple chronic illnesses. And I've had freelancers turn around and say to me like, oh, this is so good. Like I can have a depressive episode or a bad period and I don't have to fake a stomachache. Right? Which for me was just like one of those lines that I thought, oh, that is, I don't have to fake, not a stomachache, but like, what can I tell them that will make sense to them so they won't give me kind of like crap for it? I'll tell them that I'm throwing up, right? Like,
yeah, or like I have a cold.
Yeah.
Because you'll get over that in a few days.
But even then, sometimes, like I've been a school teacher, and if I'd said, oh, I've got a cold, they'd be like, get in. Like,
yeah,
cold's not enough. Like, if you're vomiting, though, then they're like, don't come in. Please don't come in. Don't stay away, right? But so here's the kind of flip side advice. Don't create infrastructures where people have to fake vomiting to basically, like, manage their bodies in ways that, like, you have to trust them. You have to trust them that they're not, one person out of every 10 might be pulling a fast one on you, but 9 out of 10 people, especially people who've got chronic illness, disability, neurodivergence, people whose bodies kind of are a bit annoying most of the time, one way or another, generally will be dragging themselves through illness to get to work rather than pretending, rather than kind of using it as an excuse to get out of work. People who use it as an excuse to get out of work don't experience this stuff because it's really boring and annoying to have to constantly cancel because you're not feeling well.
Yeah, you would rather be at work or keeping busy.
Or making
like,
money,
for sure.
paying a rent.
Yeah. So, Zara, what does your dream vision of accessibility online and in AI daily life look like 10 years from now?
Oh, that's, again, such a good question. So I know it's hard, right? Because like I've been doing this for long enough that I know 10 years doesn't move the needle that much. That sounds like a really defeatist answer, but it's an honest one, right? Because I think it's really easy to be like, in the future, things will be better is another one of these narratives that we're fed, right? Like, the line of progress always goes up rather than backwards or down. And I think that there is a worry. I'm a bit of an AI skeptic. I think that there's a lot of problems with the kind of like the rush to embrace AI.
But when thinking about accessibility, like, let's just take AI out of it.
So I really, really hope that, both new businesses and organizations and institutions and existing ones just do like way better in terms of recognizing that, like, generally, like, figures range somewhere between 16 and 25% of any population. You could literally count heads and you'll bump into disabled, chronically or neurodivergent people, even if crucially, they don't identify as that. Everyone knows someone with arthritis, who's dyslexic, who's got, who's autistic, who's got ADHD. Everyone knows somebody who's got a heart problem. Everyone knows someone who's like lives like this, but they don't conceptualize it as a kind of as a group of people.
And I'm not an expert like you, but I think that it will become more like normalized in the
really
future.
hope so.
Like, and I think it is already, like, but it does have a long way to go, like, for sure. What has given you the most strength in your life to be resilient?
I mean, bullheadedness helps, right? Like just being really stubborn, just being like, no, I'm going to do it this way, which is probably connected to the neurodivergence. When you persistently encounter adversity and like belittling and being undercut and social structures that are kind of geared to that, the spaces aren't built for you and you can feel it, right? You can choose to just go home, go to bed and not do anything. Right. But like, I think you, like me, like you figure out a way to show up anyway. And you figure out a way to, some days it's going to make you cry and some days it's going to make you want to punch the wall. And some days you'll just like grin through it and you'll be able to make a joke. And I think that having that experience and still kind of figuring out how to do it anyway is in itself like probably one of the best trainings for how to have and embody that kind of resilience and strength.
Basically, like showing up and consistency and a little bit of stubbornness, like, is what you're saying, right?
In a way, like having the experience of being in a marginalized body in some way or other, right? It kind of, it doesn't have to, it's not necessary, but I think that it can, if you've got the right character combination, be the extra kind of like sort of seasoning on the top. We shouldn't have to develop the strength that we do.
Yeah, like we should be met at like the level that we are individually.
I think that there's a problem with the fact that some of us have to grow such hard heads.
Whether you have like ADHD, dyslexia, everyone is so unique. And the fact that we're put into school systems and colleges and society and workplaces that everyone has to learn the same way is not fair. Where can our audience find you?
So I have 2 toddlers, so I'm inconsistent with my social media. My history as a poster is a little bit in the past right now, but I hope to return to being a poster one day. You can find me on LinkedIn, you can find me on Blue Sky, and you can find me on Instagram. You can also find my fabulous social enterprise at academicaudio-transcription.com and look out for some great new projects that we're working on. We're moving into supporting business owners with digital accessibility to help people just do better. Like I said, just start the journey, just make the changes. It's all right. It doesn't have to be hard. We'll help you through it and just do something, That's what we want.